I started making videos back in 2012 with the goal of dispelling some of the misinformation that was coming out at that time. And man, was there a lot to cover. With a cash infusion from Michael Bloomberg, there was a barrage of press releases from anti-gun groups and studies commissioned with pre-drawn conclusions. There was also news agencies that was all too willing to report on all this without even basic fact-checking. So I did my best to fill that gap. So here we are 4 years later, and to be perfectly honest, it's a little harder to find the motivation to make that type of video. Not because there aren't things to dispel. On the contrary, media bias is more blatant and rampant than ever, and the anti-gun studies are very well funded. No, the reason I'm finding it a little harder is that I've covered all of this before. The anti-gun industry is just regurgitating the same disproven crap with new headlines and new dates in order to grab headlines and add to the body of evidence that they can later cite. Let me give you two recent examples. Everytown for Gun Safety, an ironic name at best, has updated and re-released their report on school shootings. Now, this report was widely debunked the first time around, even by CNN and the Washington Post, and of course by me, here and here. But to summarize, in order to get these numbers, Everytown included any time a weapon was discharged on or near an educational institution's campus. It included events such as suicides in nearby homes or in college dorm rooms, negligent discharges off campus but near a school, as well as police shooting at suspects near college campuses. Now, very few of these events could be called a school shooting by any reasonable person, but you don't have to take my word for that. Bob Owens over at Bearing Arms has gone through them one at a time, and using criteria that, in my opinion, is very generous to the gun ban group, he tallied them all up. Even with this generous criteria, the gun ban group fared very poorly. The next example comes from the New York Times, where the editors penned a piece claiming that concealed carriers are a threat to public safety. To support this opinion, they cited two studies by the Violence Policy Center. The first one claiming that guns are rarely used in self-defense, and the second claiming that concealed carry permit holders are responsible for 898 non-self-defense deaths since 2007. Now, leaving alone that the Violence Policy Center is an anti-gun group, not a research organization, and that none of their studies have ever survived the rigors of peer review, let's delve into the specifics of their claim. To support their statement that self-defense with a firearm is very rare, the New York Times quotes the Violence Policy Center study that I debunked here. In summary, the Violence Policy Center uses an incomplete data set to show a low number of justifiable homicides and conflates justifiable homicides with defensive use of a firearm. In reality, a very low percentage of defensive use of firearm involve discharging the firearm at all, let alone killing the attacker. Contrast the Violence Policy Center's number in the hundreds with the CDC's estimate of annual defensive firearm use of 500,000. A review of the Violence Policy Center data on concealed carriers is even more troubling. First, of the 898 deaths they cite, 293 were suicides, some of which may not even have involved the use of a gun. Secondly, they use multiple non-mutually exclusive sources and don't correlate. So there are instances of single cases being counted as many as 4 times. Lastly, a number of these cases are still pending, some of which will be ruled justified. But even if we accept the Violence Policy Center's numbers, if you consider that there are more than 14 million legal concealed carriers in the U.S. today, and using the Violence Policy Center's figures, we find that the homicide rate for legal concealed carriers is 0.14 per 100,000. Now contrast that to the national rate of 3.9 per 100,000. And we find, and this is worth stressing, that using the Violence Policy Center's inflated numbers, concealed carriers are 28 times less likely to commit murder than your average citizen. Now, how is that a threat to public safety? Now, neither of these reports are new. They're both updates of old and previously debunked studies. The errors of the authors have been pointed out to them, but they still repeated them. So these are not just cases of bad science, but are deliberate attempts to give a false impression. And like I've said before, if you have to lie to gain support, you're not worth supporting.